By late December 1914, the Great War was supposed to have been over. Instead, it had frozen into a brutal stalemate. On the Western Front, a vast network of trenches scarred the earth, a continuous line of mud and steel stretching from the cold waters of the North Sea down to the Swiss border. This was a new kind of warfare, defined by frost, disease, and the constant, gnawing fear of an unseen enemy. Casualties had already reached staggering numbers, and both sides were grimly settling in for a long, grinding conflict. But as Christmas Eve arrived, along certain sectors of the front, particularly in the flat, Soden fields of Flanders, something extraordinary and entirely unplanned began to unfold. It started not with a command, but with a light. German soldiers, huddled in their trenches, cautiously raised small, flickering candles and tiny Christmas trees, their Tannenbaum, above the parapets. Then, a sound drifted across the shell-pocked wasteland of no man's land. It was a Christmas carol. Stille Nacht. Holy Night. From the opposing British trenches, an answer came back, their own songs, carrying through the still, frosty air. Slowly, voices began calling out greetings into the darkness, not with anger, but with curiosity. Then, a few heads appeared, inching cautiously above the sandbags. Hands were raised, open, a universal signal to show they held no weapons. Where trust held, a fragile, local ceasefire took root. A handful of soldiers, then more, climbed out of the relative safety of their trenches and walked into the forbidden ground that separated them. On Christmas Day, these spontaneous truces blossomed. Men who had been trying to kill each other just hours before met in the middle of no man's land. They shook hands. They shared what little they had, exchanging cigarettes, buttons from their uniforms, tins of food, and pieces of chocolate. In certain areas, they held brief, informal services for the fallen and worked together in joint burial parties, finally bringing dignity to the bodies that had lain unrecovered between the lines for weeks. Accounts from the time, written in letters home, mention informal football games, also known as kickabout. These were not organized matches, but small, impromptu games played with whatever could be found for a bowl, like a bundle of rags or an empty tin can. They happened in a few places where the ground was firm enough and the goodwill was strong. But it's important to remember, this wasn't universal. The truce itself didn't happen everywhere. In many sectors, the fighting continued with its usual ferocity. Where it did occur, it was a grassroots event, a decision made by frontline soldiers, not by generals in distant headquarters. Nearly everything we know about these events comes directly from the soldiers themselves, through the letters and diaries they wrote in the moment. Across different accounts from both British and German troops, the details echo with remarkable consistency. The singing that broke the silence, the surreal meetings in the open, the simple exchanges of tobacco and food, and the shared sacred task of burying their dead. For a few short hours, on December 24th and 25th, in 1914, something incredible happened. They created a brief, fragile peace, but it could not last. As December 26th dawned, the reality of the war machine ground back into motion. Officers, acting on strict orders from high command, instructed their men to resume hostilities. In certain areas, there was a reluctance to be the first to break the peace. A few soldiers fired deliberately high over the enemy's heads, or shouted a warning before the first shots rang out. By the end of the week, however, the familiar sounds of rifle fire and artillery had returned along the entire front. After 1914, military leaders on all sides took decisive steps to prevent any repeat of such fraternization. They planned artillery strikes and raids on Christmas, switching units often to keep enemy soldiers on their toes, while small, isolated acts of goodwill might have occurred in later years. Nothing on the scale of the 1914 Christmas Truce ever happened again. The Christmas Truce did not alter the course of the war. It didn't bring about a lasting peace or change a single strategic plan. But its significance lies elsewhere. It demonstrated that even in the midst of industrial-scale slaughter, the shared humanity of soldiers could, for a moment, overcome the hatred they had been ordered to feel. Without any direction from above, in multiple places, men independently chose to see the person, not the uniform. For one night, the guns fell silent. Voices carried farther than bullets, and in the cold, clear air of Christmas. Enemies looked at one another and saw, if only for a moment, a human being.